Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the astrological forecast for the entire month of June of 2022. Joining me today are astrologers Austin Coppock and Catherine Urban. Welcome, both of you.
Hey.
Hey, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us as a guest co-host for this month. First, let me show the astrological alignments calendar for this month, just to give an overview of what we'll be talking about. Then we'll introduce Catherine. We'll do a little bit of a review at the beginning of this episode of things that happened in the astrology and the news over the past month. And then eventually we'll jump into the astrological forecast for the month of June. So here is a diagram for those watching the video version of the movements of the planets and where they'll start at the very beginning of the month, and then how far through each of the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. Here's the planetary alignments calendar, which shows planetary stations as well as lunations and ingresses, or the movement of planets into different signs of the zodiac. So we started off with the month at the very top of June with Mercury stationing direct in the sign of Taurus and ending its 3-week retrograde period on the 3rd of June. Pretty much simultaneously, we have Saturn stationing retrograde on the 4th of June, pretty closely squaring Mercury, which I think we'll focus in on a lot, that combination at the very beginning of the month. Then a couple of weeks later, Mercury ingresses or moves into the sign of Gemini, its home sign, on the 13th of June. The next day, we have our first lunation of the month, which is a full moon in the sign of Sagittarius on the 14th. The following week, on the 21st, the sun ingresses into the sign of Cancer, which is the beginning of Cancer season and the beginning of the summer in the northern hemisphere. Then the very next day, Venus moves into the sign of Gemini on the 22nd. We get our second lunation of the month, which is a new moon in Cancer on the 28th. And the same day, Neptune stations retrograde in the sign of Pisces. So those are some of the major configurations and ingresses we're going to be talking about this month in June. Let's see, before we get there. So welcome, Catherine. You're joining us as a co-host, guest co-host this month, for the first time ever. You and Nick Dig and Best and I, and a couple of months ago, did a really amazing episode on secondary progressions. And I had such a fun time doing that with you that I thought it'd be good to do a forecast with you today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Chris. That episode was super fun. And of course, it's exciting to be back here for the forecast. June is looking interesting.
Yeah, it's a good month to join us for this, I think. And you actually do your own private forecasts on your own YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/Catherine Urban, right?
Yeah, I do weekly videos. I call them astrology shots. I try to keep the videos brief and I cover sort of aspect by aspect. And I try to pinpoint and feature the ones that are sort of the biggest deal of the week.
Brilliant. I love that. And there's just a quick snapshot of that in your videos. Cool. And we're doing a forecast today in Austin. You are getting ready to go to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is the first in-person astrology conference that's happened in a few years, or the first major one. You're leaving like tomorrow, right?
Yeah, I'll already be in Seattle in 24 hours.
Awesome. So yeah, by the time this is released, you're going to be like knee deep in astrology conference and giving lectures and workshops and the whole 9 yards. Indeed.
Yeah, it's my big workshop, my like 5-hour-ish workshop is it's actually before the first day. So be starting off with a bang.
Yeah, it's nice to do the best thing, like, and the most laborious thing, like right at the beginning.
Yeah, it makes the like giving just hour 15 lectures seem like nothing.
Yeah, like a cake.
Whereas if I was waiting for that, if that was looming the entire time I was there, it would be haunting my every moment.
Right. Yeah, I think at the last NORWAC, you and I did a post-conference, like at the end of the conference, and that was a long thing to do an entire conference first and then do a workshop. Anyway, so let's do some review first a little bit and talk about some news stories and some astrology that has happened over the past month, as we always do, as we sort of check in with, what happened, what some of our predictions were, and how that manifested, as well as just news stories that came up and what their astrological tie-ins were. So one of the biggest things that happened over the last month, and one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about, of course, in the last episode, was that there was two major eclipses that happened over the course of the past month. one of them in the sign of Taurus and the other in the sign of Scorpio. So I actually went out and took some pictures. So I was going to show some pictures of the lunar eclipse in Scorpio that happened in the middle of the month, just because it was such a striking visual phenomenon. Like I never get over how striking eclipses are, not just solar eclipses, where it's just obviously, the middle of the day, and then all of a sudden the moon moves in front of the sun and it becomes like nighttime in the middle of the day. But what happens during a lunar eclipse, people often don't realize, is actually very, very similar, where the moon is bright and it's shining and it's at its fullest. And then all of a sudden it starts being eclipsed, like literally a shadow starts moving across it. And then eventually it becomes like a quarter of the way, then half of the way dark. Then eventually the entire thing gets darkened and it goes from a bright full moon to almost like a dark new moon. And then in this instance, it actually became red, and it had this like reddish color to it at the very height of the lunar eclipse. So it really reminded me of the whole notion of the nodes and how the nodes are associated with dragons, because it kind of looks like somebody was like taking bites out of the moon, basically, or like a chunk out of the moon once you're part of the way through, until eventually the entire thing just disappears as if it's getting eaten or swallowed up whole. And I thought that was an interesting sort of reflection as I was sitting there watching this happen live over the course of a few hours, and just thinking about some of the ancient imagery that's associated with the eclipses and with nodes.
Yeah, and although dragon or serpent is the most common motif, there are other cultures that have like a different giant, scary celestial beast that devours the sun and the moon.
Interesting.
Wolves and jaguars and other critters.
Okay. Yeah, and the other thing that was really notable about it is just in my city in Denver, where you could see the eclipse as it was happening, and it was pretty far up there in the sky and visible. I looked around and there was just like tons of people that came outside or just stopped what they were doing to watch it. And it's very rare that you see, everybody in the same city just stop what they're doing and all focus their intention or focus their attention on the same thing. It's kind of a weird phenomenon in that way, where everyone suddenly like realizes there's something extraordinary happening or something unusual that's out of the ordinary that sort of like demands or commands their attention. And there's something that's striking about it just for that reason, of thinking of how many people are just paying attention to the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the eclipses are by far the most visually dramatic astronomical event that happens on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're really, really profound alignments too. Like you're saying, Chris, like it doesn't matter what your astronomical or astrological interest is, like they're extremely compelling. But the more you know about the mechanics of them and how they work, I think the even more mesmerizing they are. Like the fact that the sun and moon just happen to be the exact same size from our geocentric point of view, it seems too perfect to be a coincidence to me. To me, it's something really sublime and something I continue to be in awe of. And if you get the chance to see a total, you should definitely put that on the bucket list. It's life-changing.
Yeah. I've heard of like astronomers that are like eclipse chasers that will like go to different parts, travel to different parts of the world just in order to view a complete solar eclipse or a total solar eclipse.
Yeah, they're called umbrophiles.
Okay, nice.
Well, we got to see one of those in most of the United States in 2017.
Yeah, in 2017.
Right? Remember what happy times that brought?
The Great American Eclipse. Yeah, which was in it was like 6 months into Trump's presidency, which was one of the things I always thought about or associate with that eclipse.
There's going to be another one, April 8th, 2024. It's going to go right over Cleveland, too. All the Cleveland pre-show chat. Yeah, it's going right over my house. So April 8th, 2024, it's going to split the country in half again.
Nice. Metaphorically, hopefully just metaphorically. But that, of course, will also be, you mentioning 2024, that'll be 6 months in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election.
I'm sure everyone will be at peace and have come to accord by 2024. That seems like a I mean, is there anything happening that year that would bring people together?
Yeah, we'll just
elections bring people together.
Yeah, we'll all be sitting around singing Kumbaya when that eclipse happens. I'm sure 2 years from now. I'm calling it now. That's my prediction. So here is the eclipses calendar that Paula Bellomini made for us that shows those first 2 eclipses that just took place. And you always have to remember, though, that eclipses are part of a series and a sequence of eclipses that will keep bouncing back and forth and taking place in the same 2 sets of signs, in this case, Taurus and Scorpio, in 6-month increments. So whatever the keyword I always use for eclipses is major beginnings and major endings. Whatever sense of major beginnings and endings for many people, or for some people, especially with fixed angles, that this started or coincided with over the past month, you'll probably see another sequence of events connected to that in 6 months' time later this year, between October 25th and November 8th, or around that time frame, when we get the next set of eclipses in the signs of Scorpio and Taurus. It was actually it's been almost, I don't want to say hilarious, because that's not the right term, but just seeing so many people with major fixed placements having major shakeups and major endings or major beginnings in their life over the course of the past month. It's been really striking to see that myself, of just like different people I know. Did you guys witness any interesting things like that in terms of clients or people having major eclipse stories that opened up at that time?
What I can say is that there's a lot happening for the fixed signs right now. And my theory on that is that eclipse, like the fixed signs, are the most stable and steady and the least movable. And so you really need a lot of repetitive punches, so to speak, in order to get, or illuminations, in order to encourage that fixed energy to shift. Like fixed placements need to be really, really, really sure that making that big change is going to be worth it. So I think that between Saturn, Uranus, and the eclipses, it's sort of building, and I am starting to see people finally take that big, brave leap that they've been sort of talking themselves up to for a while now.
Yeah, I think one of the things we said last month that I think came strikingly true is that we kind of suspected that even though the Saturn-Uranus square that was so prominent last year and is supposedly further away now and is 10 degrees away, one of the things we suspected is that the eclipses were going to reactivate that square and tie it back together, and perhaps even accelerate some of the changes that were indicated, or the disruptions that were indicated by that Saturn-Uranus square in and of itself. And that's really happened, I think, in a major way, not just in people's individual lives and birth charts, but also in mundane events in terms of, for example, like the economy and things really starting to tank or become much more destabilized over the course of the past few weeks. Is that something you're following pretty closely, Austin?
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying that literally the whole time. I was like, 2022 is more Saturn Uranus than 2021. The North Node, add that Rahu steroid boost to Uranus is just can't be denied. And now we've seen the first injection, the first cycle, if you will, and it's pretty obvious. But yeah, I mean, all the supply disruption stuff, that's just literally a standard, historically standard Uranus and Taurus thing. And like volatility of commodity prices, all this normal Uranus and Taurus stuff has just been taken up to the next level. You have the volatility of the market. You have, is Bitcoin worth everything? Is it worth nothing? Just all the stuff,
For sure. I've noticed the same thing. And I think also with the Great Resignation, I think a lot of that is really ramping up now that the Saturn Uranus square is involved with the nodes and the eclipses, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Uranus, Taurus, and the mobilization or radicalization of labor, 100%. And again, that's stuff we saw pretty clearly last year. But instead of quieting down as Saturn and Uranus, like got a little space, right? It's shadow dragon, roid time. Yeah, just imagine, the poison is associated with both of the nodes. So I always, as an exercise, I like to imagine like what kind of poison is in the dragon's fangs and what is in its stinger tail, right? And I think it's, I think it's like a combination of ecstasy and steroids that's in the head.
Yeah, so eclipses we have now confirmed do put like a nitro boost on top of whatever, especially outer planet configurations they're tied into. And certainly having we had a Taurus eclipse, a lunar eclipse last November, and that one was also visible, but it was still finishing up the Sagittarius Gemini series. So this was the first time that we also got the other end of that, and the other shoe dropped with the Scorpio eclipse at the other side of that, really beginning this eclipse series. So it was interesting seeing it come into full effect at this point, rather than just getting this sort of inkling of it that we got late last year.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, it's literally in any direction that you look, over the last month, you can see that the symbolism of that, the Uranus Saturn stuff everywhere, right? Whether it's economically or, wherever. And so it's really interesting to have that going on, which is a lot in and of itself, but to have that overlapping with Mercury retrograde, right? Because we had, there were also huge Mercury retrograde stories, right? Like just, so let's see, like there was I don't know, is Elon Musk going to buy Twitter or not, right? There was and then
backtracking on it.
Yeah, and then there was the leak about the Supreme Court leak with pretty big maybe, right? And then you also had the U.S. government was like, now there's going to be a misinformation czar or head person, and now there's not, right? Like literally about controlling the flow of information, like all huge, like big Mercury retrograde stuff.
Go
ahead.
I was going to say, did you see the George Bush Freudian slip?
Oh, that was... Please share.
That was pretty incredible. Yeah, George Bush was giving a speech and trying to condemn Putin and saying, like, this guy went into this country and invaded, and then he said Iraq.
Yeah, it was like the unlawful invasion of Iraq.
And then he went with it though. And I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, he does have some Gemini placements, if I'm remembering his chart correctly. And he kind of just rolled with it, and he laughed at himself, and he was like, well, I'm in my 70s. And yeah, it was pretty great though. One of the best Mercury retrograde slips I've seen in a while.
I mean, he's sort of the king of those. If you look back at his presidency,
they published
his oratory during his time in office.
They published entire books on that called Bushisms, of just like his flubs and slip-ups of stuff.
The children learning and all that.
Yeah. Good times. And then that's funny that you mentioned, because we mentioned the Twitter deal that had just come out last month, I think the same day that we did the last forecast Austin. And then that's actually a good example of a Mercury retrograde, where sometimes early in a Mercury retrograde, you'll do something, but then you'll either have to redo it, or sometimes it's taken back. And now the price of Twitter has tanked over the course of the past month, as have a bunch of different tech stocks for different companies like Apple and Amazon, Netflix, etc. And so it's almost like he's trying to backtrack out of the deal at this point, because it's much less financially, makes less sense even than it did when he proposed it a month ago.
And so I look forward, so some of these Mercury retrograde stories already have an ending, but some of these are pretty open-ended. And so I'm certainly looking forward to Mercury going direct in early June, and then, crossing that same set of degrees for a third time to get us back. So what's actually going on with Roe? What's actually going on with Twitter? What's actually, because again, these are very large maybes. And I was thinking about, so why are they large maybes? Mercury's retrograde every 4 months. It's not always as big a deal. These are large things. And I think part of it is with Mercury stationing in early Gemini and going back to like the mid last decan of Taurus, Mercury is making 3 aspects to Jupiter and basically making 3 aspects to Saturn and the North Node, or really close to the North Node. So that Mercury is pinging Jupiter and Saturn. Right, Jupiter and Saturn together sort of create the entire world, right? They're the 2 visible, long, slow cycle planets. So these are all like, big, slow-moving, important issues.
Yeah, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Mercury station at the beginning once we get to the forecast. So before we fully get there, let's finish the review, because the last point, and one that's been mentioned already a couple of times that was major news over the past month, was the Roe versus Wade decision, where I guess the sequence of events was that the Supreme Court, a written preliminary document of a decision that's probably going to come out soon, was leaked by somebody in the Supreme Court that indicated that they were going to strike down or essentially reverse the Roe versus Wade decision, which was the ruling decades ago in the United States that legalized abortion. And this is actually something we talked about in the year ahead forecast way back in December, because we primarily associated with at the time, because we knew that the case was going to be heard, I think, starting back in December, and that was going to start, we noted, under the Venus retrograde in Pluto. And Lisa Scheim pointed out to me that the written document that was leaked over the past few weeks, that it was written up, or the date on it had a date of February 10th. So a lot of the discussions that were happening surrounding that, or that document, evidently went back to February of 2022, and that was back in the tail end of Venus being retrograde, or finishing up its retrograde cycle in the sign of Capricorn, where it was still with Pluto, co-present with Pluto, and also conjoining Mars. So, and on the one hand, the Venus-Pluto symbolism made sense, or we talked about it making sense in the year ahead forecast because of having to do with topics of like life and death, but also issues of like control of like women's bodies and things like that, which are all very Plutonian type themes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was noticing too that the day of the leak, the day we all learned about it, was when Venus ingressed into Aries. And not only was Venus entering the sign of her detriment, but I thought that was very symbolic of Venus having to do with largely there's a correspondence with women, but I think Venus also has a lot to do with sexuality. And, the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is sort of the tip of the iceberg for a lot of other issues, being that Roe v. Wade is rooted in privacy, in the sense that a person's right to choose for their own medical decisions is supposed to be private. Like the government, there's certain things that the government can't have say over. That's the whole idea of privacy. And so that brings into question a lot of other things. This definitely affects women, but it also affects people with uteruses. It affects, and it could potentially affect a lot of people. So I thought that was interesting. And I also thought it was sort of a prequel to Jupiter and Aries too. Something that we're going to be seeing a lot with that transit. Because that was another thing that happened recently. Jupiter's ingress. Yeah,
that was right. That was a very significant ingress last month. Right. Well, and if we look so Jupiter sort of in its own place, like its root significations is it likes to create, accord and peace and justice and chill. But what does Jupiter do in a Mars-ruled sign? Right? Like Jupiter carries with it a very strong moral component, right? Jupiter is very interested in what's right, right? It's associated with law and religion and all of the human arts and sciences for figuring out what might be the right thing to do. And so it carries that sort of moral onus into, a much more combative sign, right? Aries is hands down more combative than Pisces, right? So it's, in some ways, Jupiter in Aries is very much a have it out over what's right. right? Or it's like, let's have a, let's have a fight over what's right and what's not.
It's a very outspoken and very opinionated placement and energy. And I think Jupiter in Aries is also a very independent thinker. It's not afraid to stand out. It's not afraid to, it's prepared to make some enemies. It's prepared to be disagreed with, and it kind of gets off on it. I think Jupiter in Aries likes a little bit of banter there.
Yeah. I think, like Jupiter in Aries is not nearly as concerned with consensus as Jupiter in Pisces or Sag. Right, Sag is fiery, but it wants to bring everybody around to the same point of view, whereas Jupiter in Aries is just fine with people being on the other side. And I think part of, to connect it back to what I was saying last month, part of what Jupiter in Aries teaches is sort of how to be in conflict or combat or in a situation where consensus isn't possible.
Yeah, it's fun. Last month when I did the Aries episode, one of the things I thought was so interesting was just Aries energy being the person, sometimes the person in the room that says the thing that everybody's thinking, but like nobody wants to say in polite company, or nobody wants to be the one to stand up and tell somebody else, to sit down if they need to, or to just like say the thing, which sometimes can be blunt or sometimes can be very rough around the edges and uncalled for, to like do the uncalled for thing, but otherwise sometimes can be the called for thing as well. And the line between those two is sometimes hard to figure out, I think, for Aries.
Yeah, well, we were, I forget who brought it up, but last month we talked about Jupiter in Aries and the power of Aries of being first. Right. And that's another angle on what you're saying. Like the first to say a thing, even if plenty of people have been thinking it.
Yeah. And that there can be a danger to that sometimes. Sometimes it's like what's necessary in order to move things forward. And other times it can be not necessary and can just be stirring the pot like unnecessarily. So with Jupiter, though, we bring concepts of an ideological component and like beliefs and other things into that, which can be divisive and that can be tricky. So sort of divisiveness when it comes to political philosophy in this instance.
Yeah, I think Jupiter in Aries is unafraid to go rogue. And yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more people sort of veering away from affiliations and sort of going out on a limb and being able to speak their truth, whatever that may be.
It makes sense. Yeah, bravery is definitely one of the Jupiter and Aries gifts.
One of the things I was thinking about a lot recently, the ninth house, in noticing somebody go through like a political transformation, was that connection that astrologers always talk about where politics, when the politics are associated with the ninth house, but also religion is associated with the ninth house. And oftentimes we think about those being just like separate things. And we think about our political views being so rational and like logical, and that we're making these based on rational deductions, but we don't often acknowledge or realize the extent to which our political beliefs are very much tied in with, and not that dissimilar with, almost like religious beliefs, and can sometimes be influenced by things as simple as what you grew up with and like your family background and things like that, influencing what direction you go politically or what you choose to believe. Or that sometimes like going through a major political transformation can be like going through religious transformation. And there can be a very similar thing when it comes to the ideology and things like that. It's not always simply about morals, but morals can be more influenced by our beliefs and less by logic than we sometimes think.
Yeah, well, I think it all ties back to sort of what you think is real, right? How your model for the world, which is how I treat the ninth house a lot, is like, what does a person think is real, right? And based on what you think is real, your model of reality, they're going to be, depending on the picture you arrive at, or consume, there are going to be certain ethical, ethical musts that arise from every an idea of the world, a worldview is not ethically inert. If you think that X, then it makes sense to do Y. And that's all, it's ninth house. Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, that's and that notion of like acting on one's beliefs or acting on one's philosophy or in some instance politics and a sort of political activism, that might be a good keyword as we're thinking about what Jupiter in Aries is all about this year, especially now that Mars has literally in the past few minutes ingressed into Aries, and we're going to see it amplifying some of that stuff that Jupiter is doing in that sign. So with that, maybe it's a good time to transition into talking about the forecast since we're about 30 minutes into the episode. Shall we start talking about June? All right. All right. So pulling up the alignments calendar again, the very first thing that we have to talk about and focus on at the top of the month is that Mercury, which is recently stationed retrograde in Gemini, and it retrograded back into Taurus. And on the 3rd of June, it's going to be stationing direct late in Taurus at 26 degrees. And something that's tied into that seems very important is that Saturn is pretty much simultaneously stationing retrograde towards the end of Aquarius, where it's squaring Mercury. And that's pretty important and notable because that's actually very, very similar to what happened at the end of 2020, around the time of the 2020 presidential election in November, is we had something very similar, just in the opposite sign, where Mercury went retrograde and it stationed direct, but it stationed direct very closely squaring Saturn, I think pretty much like on election day in the US in November of 2020. And what ended up happening is these themes that are associated with slowness and delays, which is both a Mercury retrograde thing, it's a Mercury stationary thing, but it's also a Mercury Saturn thing. All of that got compounded, and we had this delays in this long drawn out process of the counting and the tallying of the votes, so that it wasn't immediately known on election day what the outcome of the election was. And it wasn't known fully until several days, or in some weeks, like some instances, like weeks later. So we might see similar things coming up here with Mercury stationing, squaring Saturn.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call. And we're talking about some of these like pending maybes that Mercury retrograde posed over the course of May, and probably some of the Mercury direct result will be check in next week or the next week or later. It might be the announcement of delays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is quite a layered configuration because not only do you have two planets standing still and effectively reversing within a day of each other and in a tight square to one another, but there's also eclipse activations thrown in here. So in true Gemini season style, it feels a little chaotic. It doesn't feel very cut and dry. It feels like a cut and paste collage. Like a lot of things are sort of coming together within a few days here. So it's a lot to tease apart, but I think we're about to do that.
I like that coming together and teasing apart. I think what comes together will be very difficult to interpret, right? Generally speaking, the Dragon's Head North Node doesn't clarify matters, right? It actually, both the nodes tend to complicate and tangle things. And Mercury coming back to station very close, like 3-degree conjunction with the North Node in a sign. Taurus is not an awesome place for Mercury. It doesn't make it easier to see exactly what's what. And, and Mercury is is pretty tightly on the fixed star Coppock algol. And as far as keeping a cool head and, thinking about things clearly, algol symbols literally a decapitated head. And there's the losing one's head. And so, what comes together will, I think, take a while to tease apart. I do worry that there'll be just some no, I don't even worry. I just expect that there'll be some horrific things that come to light. Right? It'll be like, yeah, and there's a mass grave here, or this, there's just there'll be some unpleasant facts about what's already happened in addition, sort of to the side of these ongoing issues.
Yeah, and that symbolism of Medusa is so compelling at this stage in history, I feel. Just with Medusa, if we break down the myth of Medusa, she was a beautiful maiden who was essentially turned into a monster based on a trauma that she endured. Like, there was an infringement on her autonomy, and she was demonized, and she was turned into this monster. And so there is a story there of, we could say patriarchal, we could say, yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we could attribute there. But I think that symbolism of Medusa is really poignant at this time when we're talking about the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade and 50% of this country potentially losing their choice to make medical decisions for themselves. So yeah, I think people are pretty upset right now. And we're starting off the month with Mars and Jupiter in Aries. So yeah, that is definitely part of the recipe.
Yeah. And one of the things also worth mentioning here that I feel like is often an overlooked side of Mercury-Saturn combinations is that Saturn usually rejects or says no to things, and that's part of its overarching sort of umbrella concept or archetype for Saturn. And when you put it together with Mercury, one of the things that sometimes happens is that, especially in like a natal chart, people can be highly critical or very good at seeing the faults of things, very good at like seeing the problems with something or pointing out the problems, which can lead to a sort of hypercriticalness, which sometimes most people, if they meet somebody with heavy Mercury-Saturn hard aspects, will experience it as that person being like overly critical of them externally, but sometimes it's also turned internally on the person themselves. But that's one of the things that can lead to a sort of deadlocking or a slowing down or inability to act or speak or do things, is the sort of critical nature of that combination being turned inwards and leading to a grinding halt of Mercury's otherwise like tendency to communicate and have movement and forward momentum and direction. And it'll be interesting to see around that time with Mercury stationing direct, how the critical component of Saturn comes up, sometimes perhaps in destructive ways, but also sometimes potentially in constructive ways of what needs to be criticized or what needs to be like rejected or something like that, like where sometimes seeing the faults in something is necessary and useful.
Yeah, or literally Saturn saying like, hold on, let's just sit and be quiet and think about this for a little longer.
Right. Yeah.
Which would solve
move
about
on.
half the world's problems.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that does. I love that connection back to the election, Chris, that you brought up, and how we saw a very similar energy and how there could potentially be a freeze, like there could be a stalling, and hey, let's rethink this a little bit before we move forward. So hopefully, my fingers are crossed that we might see some sort of delay in that overturning. But yeah, I also just think that between these two parties, Mercury and Saturn, that Saturn's definitely the stronger one. Saturn here has domicile, triplicity, rulership, and it's in its own terms. And poor little Mercury doesn't really have a lot going on.
It's Mercury's in Saturn's decan.
Oh, that too. Yes.
Yeah.
That too. So yeah, I think we see with the strong Saturn too, a big impetus for control. And certainly since Saturn has been in Aquarius, we've had to follow more rules, right? Like we've had to do this whole social distancing thing and everything else that went with that. And this just seems like another incarnation of it. Like this, if this ruling does happen, it's the first time that a Supreme Court overturns precedent to limit rights versus create more of them. So.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's overturning a mandatory legality.
And they've done that in the past, but it creates more freedoms usually. This would be the first time that it does the Saturnian thing of really constricting and limiting people's choices.
Sure. So on the one hand, we have that energy at the very beginning of the month, which is very prominent for at least the first week of the month or so, I would say.
Yeah, it really drags.
Yeah, there's like this slowness and this like heaviness and things feeling like ponderous. But weirdly, we have a very contrasting energy taking place over in the sign of Aries, where we have Mars and Saturn meeting up in Mars's sign. And both of those planets tend to be much more fiery planets about rapid growth and expansion. And so it's like in this other area or this other sector of the sky and this other sector of some people's charts, there's something else that's pushing to grow very rapidly and without as much forethought, and sort of like driving things forward at an exponential rate, which is kind of an interesting contrasting energy that is happening. It sort of comes to a head at the Mars-Jupiter conjunction that happens a little bit before that, which is around the very, very end of May, right around that new moon, actually at 8 degrees of Gemini on the 29th, 30th. But it's still very much there, and they're very much present for the entirety of this month as Mars is continuing to move through its home sign of Aries.
Yeah. Well, and so what's really interesting is that by the time Mercury picks up some steam and gets out of Taurus, that's going to be the new influence on Mercury. Mercury goes from being at the end of Taurus in a Saturn-ruled decan, squared by Saturn, right? Just like excruciating delays and slowness and, what's the information? What's it going to be? And then as soon as Mercury hits Gemini, I think it's on the 13th, not only do we have Mercury in its own sign and in a very fast, speedy, sign itself, Gemini, but also like immediately coming into aspect with Jupiter in Aries, like getting that, whatever that jet fuel from Jupiter in Aries. And then, will be on its way to then sextile Mars in Aries, right? So we're going from, Mercury is going from being in that Saturn, Uranus, Rahu, fixed sign sort of thing, the fixed crisis, if you will, to this like very hot and fast and bold, or configuration of this very hot, fast and bold side of things in Aries. And that's the second half of the month, basically.
It's like it's making up for lost time. Once Mercury gets back into Aries, it's got to like go back over stuff and return back to and retrace the steps where it had previously gone retrograde. And it finishes that up by the middle of June. But then, yeah, it's just making up for lost time, and it's really cruising and moving through. That's funny you mentioned Taurus and everything, because it's not just the square with Saturn, but also just the fact that Taurus itself is a slow sign. And when I did the Taurus episode this month with Mo and Pao of the Fixed Astrology podcast, one of the keywords that came up was don't rush me, as like a signification or a keyword for Taurus, which is a very good, I thought, Taurus keyword. And that's some of what Mercury is going to be experiencing up until it hits that point where it gets back into its home sign of Gemini, and then it starts rushing and moving around very rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more thing about that Mercury in the last decan of Taurus, which is literally almost the entire first half of the month. So, Chris, I know you've been getting more into tarot, right? So that's associated with the 7 of discs or coins. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith, that's literally a guy watching plants grow and looking extremely bored and frustrated. I think there'll be some of leaning on your hoe, your garden implement, and just seeing like, okay, is this going to grow? Are the plants going to die? Are they going to grow? Got to just wait.
What's going to happen here with these plants? Yeah.
Here, I'm pulling that one up. There it is. He's just... it's like he's been gardening. He's kind of exhausted, looking at what he's done or what he's created at that point. But there's also a sense of he doesn't look super happy.
Yeah. Well, and one of the common interpretations of that is that there's nothing more that can be done. You just have to wait for the result.
Okay. And that's the third decan of Taurus? Nice.
That feels really timely.
Yeah, that does feel appropriate.
Just watching the grass grow.
Yeah. All right. So going back to the beginning of the month again and just talking about some of our early stuff. So at the very end of May, one of the shifts that happens that's still coming up for us in the future as of now when we're recording this is we do have a shift of Venus moving into her home sign of Taurus by the 28th of May. And that's one of the dominant things that's happening for the entirety of, or most of June, actually, all the way until the 22nd when Venus moves into Gemini. But that might be something that we might want to touch on and focus on a little bit here, because that's one of the main energies of the month in the first couple of weeks, having Venus in her home sign. So it's like Mars is in his home sign in Aries, Venus is in Taurus, and then at a certain point we get Mercury in its home sign of Gemini.
Yeah. Well, Venus in Taurus just wants to be comfortable. It's a little harder these days with Uranus in Taurus and now with the eclipses there, but the aim is to try to be as comfortable and to practice the pause and find the simple pleasures in the moment. And I think that that's actually a really great way to stay grounded in the times that we're in, is to just drop into the senses and enjoy being human. You know, there's a crazy world out there, but we can enjoy this ice cream cone, or we can enjoy just being together and that sort of thing.
Yeah, to contrast that with the waiting in the Seven of Coins, right? Venus in Taurus is much better at having free time, right? It's like, well, just sit back, recline, ice cream, right? It is dairy, it's Taurus, right? Whatever. And so when I was looking at that, part of my last year research on this year was like, oh, can I get a Venus in Taurus talisman this year? And I was like, no, too much interference, right? But on a like experiential level, maybe the first third of Venus's time in Taurus is not so bad, but not so interfered with. But as Venus goes later into Taurus, then we start having, conjunction with relaxing Uranus. No, right? Sorry, there's no ice cream. The ice cream boat from the nation we import that from got blown up and is at the bottom of the ocean. There's not going to be ice cream for 2 months, right? The Uranus disruptiveness, and then head of the dragon energy is not necessarily relaxing, and then square to Saturn is not relaxing. So really, like first third of Venus in Taurus, like kind of more classically Venus in Taurus, but then the rest of the time spent there is rather fucked with.
Yeah, it's basically the first week of the month we get some nice Venus and Taurus energy, and maybe some of that relaxation, or even like cleaning up a little bit after the eclipses, post Mercury retrograde in Taurus. And having Venus as a counterbalancing influence, which is bringing a little bit of peace and comfort to that sector of not just the zodiac, but that sector of our birth charts and our lives, where things were getting so churned up recently. But now that we're starting to get some space from the eclipses and things like that, maybe there'll at least be that initial wave of sort of peace and relaxation as Venus moves into that sign in the first week before it starts just hitting Uranus and getting the disruption or the unsettledness of that. And then finally the sort of coldness from Saturn towards the end of that transit.
100%. And I'm remembering now in our discussion with Steph last month, we were talking about this in terms of at least attempting to stabilize what's going on in Taurus, right? And so if we think about that, it's like, maybe that looks like stock market and, various prices stabilizing, right? Which is different from a recovery. But it's like the uncertainty goes away for a little bit, where it's like, okay, well, this is where, people feeling, en masse, be like, okay, I think this is what it's worth. It's not going to jump up. It's not going to fall back down like some, a small wave of stabilization, even if the result, relative to other times is not like a stability with a big S, mm-hmm. but like, bringing some stabilizing while on a very bumpy road.
Well, and that makes sense also because by the end of May, we get our first lunation in a few weeks that's not an eclipse when we get that new moon in Gemini on the 30th, and then we get the full moon in Sagittarius on the 14th of June. So we're finally like moving out of eclipse season, and we're getting some little beginnings and little endings with those two lunations, but just back to normal in some sense, where not every new beginning or not every ending has to be like a major either catastrophic or like life-changing moment, but instead we start moving into something that's a little bit more stable to some extent.
Yeah, and that's let me just say that's one of the big problems with eclipses and the nodes is even when it's a good thing, it's often destabilizing. Like eclipses love to ruin whatever normal is. And even if it's for the better, there's that like wrenching quality, which requires some adaptation and can be shocking or disorienting.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love that we're sort of like in an eclipse hangover at the beginning of the month. Everything's sort of on pause with two stationary planets, and Venus is in Taurus and she's not bothered by anyone yet. So it's the time to sleep in and spoil yourself a little bit, because while Venus does like simple pleasures in Taurus, she also likes to be spoiled and likes the luxurious things in life too.
All right, so this is good. This is helping me with my plans. So I've got a lot to do at NORWAC, and it's going to be huge and this and that. And I was thinking to myself, I was saying to Kate, maybe last night I was like, God, maybe I'll just like take a secret vacation in my office and try to not do anything for like a week after NORWAC. I was like, maybe I'll just get drunk and play video games and eat like shit. So I've been obnoxiously clean and healthy for months now. So I'm like, maybe I can just like, lay on that like Venus and the grand couch of Venus and Taurus, right? The couch of luxurious indulgence.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That'll be our title for the first week of the month, the first week of June, the couch of luxurious indulgence.
Well, and if we want to do tarot, look up the Empress card. You'll see the inspiration for the couch of luxury.
Okay. All right. So why don't we start moving into, I think, the second week of the month, and moving into second and third week, really, because it's not until the third full week that we get our first lunation, our first official lunation of this month. So let me move the chart forward and let me know if there's anything I'm missing before we get there. But it really looks like it's once we get to that full moon in Sagittarius, and right around the same time, Mercury departing and moving into Gemini. So Mercury's in Gemini by the 13th. And then, by the 13th and 14th, we get the first lunation of the month, which is a full moon at, it looks like, 23 degrees of Sagittarius.
And it's worth noting that this full moon occurs right after a lot of those mid-month shifts we were talking about. So Mercury's just moved into Gemini, right? Like ended all the like Taurus, Saturn, agonizing slowness, and like just starting, right, to go fast and to aspect, fast, enthusiastic Jupiter in Aries. And Venus has been forcibly removed from the couch of infinite decadence and is now, is now in contact with Uranus and Rahu. And, it's a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just one thing I wanted to add about that, like while we're in rest mode and stuffing our face with fettuccine, whatever it might be, on the indulgent couch, we're also maybe having some pretty big realizations, I think, with those stationing of Mercury and Saturn. Like a lot of times those planets will bring a development of ideas, or I think Saturn very often clarity. So maybe practicing that pause is going to be helpful for us in our individual process.
Yeah, I really like that. And one thing I would add to that is, the stations are not only slowness, which is a point of motionlessness outside, but often it's when we pause that we really figure out what direction we're going to head next. And it's two planets reversing direction, right? And I was just, with Saturn going retrograde, it's like, okay, that means that's as far into Aquarius as Saturn's going to get for a long, for pretty much the rest of the year, right? So it's like, now let's like head, instead of doing more Saturn and Saturning more things, we're going to go back to looking at, the rules we made for ourselves previously, the rules that we, exist within the confines of, that we adapted to this way. And like, maybe that's changing, but like that, like pausing, motionlessness on the couch of decadence, to like appreciate the shift in direction of two planets simultaneously, which are configured to each other. Or because if you just like keep with the momentum, you'll end up going, according to two planets, in literally the wrong direction, right? Because they're both saying, no, do a U-turn.
Yeah, and that's also going to be, that's the furthest, as you said, that Saturn's gotten in Aquarius. But that's going to also, that station of Saturn is going to be a pretty important intensification for anybody where that transit is important, or if they have anything very late in the fixed signs. And I think people should really pay attention to what house that's falling in, because if there were some things that were like building up in terms of that Saturn transit, but they hadn't fully gelled yet, even if there was a very close aspect, once Saturn stations, usually that really brings some of those Saturn things really manifest at that time, and it get brought to the forefront in a person's life.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like stuff that like over the last month or two, stuff that that you kind of need to get done, and it wasn't, an emergency, but it's like, once you pause for a second and have a moon pie, you realize that you're like, oh, I do need to deal with, the roof, which is leaking, and we got to get somebody in here to do that, or, I do... whatever it is, right? Whatever like structural or slow thing. Oh, I do have to take care of that. Because there's just one thing. There's definitely something about the last month where Mercury was retrograde and we had eclipses, where it's a little like it's a little confusing, and there's a little like, oh, I need like getting caught up in what needs to be done today and tomorrow. And sometimes like projects that need to get done that month get neglected or forgotten about when there's that sort of fog of war. But as things like slow down and, we're coming back to like normal, lunations, et cetera, it's like, and you still have to pay taxes, even though May was crazy, right?
Yeah. So back to the lunation, the full moon itself in the sign of Sagittarius, it's very closely square to Neptune. So there is this like a illusory quality, or there's some quality of events that are happening around this time, even though the moon is at its fullest and at its brightest and is shining light on Sagittarius and on a certain sector of everyone's birth chart at this time. Because of that close square with Neptune, there's something about the events that are taking place at this time that actually aren't very clear, or where people may not have a very good picture of exactly what's transpiring, or may have, in some instances, even a false or illusory picture of the sort of realization that comes about around the time of the full moon.
Yeah, and I would add to that, they're very similarly, the sun and moon are both similarly configured to Saturn. Neptune and Saturn don't aspect each other, but they're both at 25, and so of their respective signs. And so both the sun and moon, both of them square Neptune, and then Saturn trines the sun while the moon sextiles the sun. And so, sometimes when you have a heavily Neptune thing, it's okay to be tuned out, right? But there's, with Saturn, there is a demand for reality and like a harmonious configuration with the facts, right? Pleasant or unpleasant. And so there's Neptune and Saturn really, by way of contrast, kind of make each other's qualities stand out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that could be really good. I mean, that could actually help ground and offset what otherwise would be a very prominent and very illusory Neptune configuration to the lunation by bringing in some grounding and some Saturn. And so maybe people won't, completely be lost in the clouds when it comes to this lunation, but will have both of those tendencies there to some extent. And it, the other configuration that's happening is it's very closely after the Venus-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. So that's tied in with this story at the same time.
Yeah, I am happy to see that Saturn there for sure. With that, a full moon in Sagittarius square Neptune, it seems like things could sort of spiral. People could get, Neptune deals with hype, and sometimes we don't have the full story. And it's a very Sagittarian thing, actually, to create basically a movement out of a one-liner idea. And so with Neptune, it's like things can sort of spiral. And yeah, I think people can just sort of get up in arms or carried away a little bit with that configuration. So that trine with Saturn is really helpful and helps sort of ground and help people find their feet a little bit. But what's so interesting about this full moon is, number one, it's our first lunation ruled by Jupiter in Aries. And number two, it's our first lunation in Sagittarius since 2019 that isn't an eclipse.
Yes, finally.
So that should offer some much needed perspective to the Sagittarius sector of our chart, which has sort of been going through a lot as far as lunations go in the last couple years.
Yeah, all of the mutable rising sign people, but especially the Sag and Gemini people, breathe a sigh of relief of just going back to having lunations that are not major life-changing events at this point in their life.
Yeah, and I would add that so Sag, when it's healthy, right? Planets in Sag are very good at figuring out what a meaningful direction to go is, right? Like there's some, the centaur archer symbol, like literally the feeder for travel, for going in a direction faster than any of the other zodiac signs. And the bow and arrow is to move the arrow extremely fast, right? There's directed motion is very much part of the Sagittarius image. And, that being purposeful, right? With the Jupiter rulership. And so, healthy planets in Sag are, they're on a quest, right? It might seem silly to someone else, but that quest energy is extremely motivating and on an internal level, unifying, right? What am I doing? I'm doing this. It's important. It's meaningful. I don't have internal contradictions about which way I'm going, right? I'm not a human or a horse. I'm a horse, I'm a centaur, God damn it. I'm both at once, which allows you to move as one. And so, with the light being interfered with in every lunation for a while in Sagittarius, great point, by the way. I didn't even think of that. It's like a restoration of that, as Sagittarius moon, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, formula for my happiness, a yes, a no, a straight line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, bringing in the seeker energy and the inspiration energy, I think with that square to Neptune, that could be for people who are on a spiritual path of some kind, that could be really activating for that as well. But yeah, I think that it sort of depends what's on your mind around that full moon, because I think that it just can balloon whatever it is, whether it's feeling confident, because again, this is our first lunation with Jupiter in Aries. And I think that that's a really beautiful energy on a personal level for helping us to take that courageous risk or helping us to do something really brave in our lives. And so I think it can be empowering, and it can be that inspiration that we need maybe to do the thing.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of go energy, go and keep going energy.
Mm-hmm. You got this.
Well, and there's something also just exciting about the Venus-Uranus conjunction that's taking place within the same span of a few days in that second week of June. This is the point where Venus kind of gets up off of her couch and goes out and starts having some pretty exciting interactions again at this time. And it's interesting that coincides with the full moon lunation this month. So Venus is kind of getting dragged out of the house by her friends, and there's some sort of seeking or encounter of something that's unique and exciting and out of the ordinary, and yet pleasurable in some way, with Venus passing over Uranus at this time, around the time of the lunation, is going to run into some problems later on once it hits this square with Saturn, and there's some like consequences or drawbacks to something that was happening earlier in the month. But nonetheless, there's still this kind of exciting period around the time of the lunation that looks very optimistic, even if it's not fully grounded in reality due to the square with Neptune.
I'm not as optimistic about about Venus with Uranus and all that. I'm not
a fun aspect for you.
Well, no, I just when I see people that have have Venus Uranus transits, it's really a coin flip as to whether it's like, sometimes it'll be the fun thing that you didn't even know you were going to do, but just as often it's like you were going to do a fun thing and then it flips and is awful, or like it's Uranus interfering with the pleasure, fun, social accord you thought you were going to have. I wouldn't bet on it either way. Actually, I would, with the other stuff around, I will be more careful about my Venusian endeavors around that time. You can't trust Uranus.
Yeah, and a full moon ruled by Jupiter, square Neptune, it feels like a lot of debauchery. So yeah, that Venus conjunct Uranus definitely is one to be mindful of, for sure.
Yeah, I've seen sometimes the positive side of the Venus-Uranus stuff can be an exciting new relationship, or finding something that enlivens you in a way that you hadn't experienced before, hadn't experienced in a while. And there's something about that transit that can sometimes, in its positive manifestation, shake things up for the better.
Yeah, and absolutely. I didn't mean to say that can't happen. It's just, for me, it seems like such a roll a d20 and see, what you get. Because I see that and the opposite of that from the same Venus-Uranus configurations.
For sure. I think it's like Venus-Uranus wants to have a wild adventure with that.
Right.
Wants to climb a bridge and drink a 40, like an abandoned bridge. And
right.
Yeah. Wants to have some kind of wild adventure.
Yeah, or what was that cliche? Wasn't there like a cliche? I think sometimes the Venus-Uranus aspects, that cliche in like late 2000s, like romantic movies of like the boring guy that meets the like manic pixie dream girl like energy type scenario. But it was like that movie was done so many times, it was kind of became a cliche at a certain point.
Yeah, it's like you just want to break the routine and mix up what feels, because again, it's in Taurus, so what feels really stable and really routine, just sort of wanting to get a reprieve from it. And sometimes that can bring new life back into the relationship dynamic.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So anyway, so we have that, and then, but there's like another side to that energy, because it hits just a few days later, like the following week, I believe, when Venus does, not too long afterwards, get to 25 degrees of Taurus, where it squares Saturn. And that is much more of a cold, distant, sort of backing off type energy of Venus sometimes, or Saturn saying no to something, and Venus either being something relational in terms of relationships that's coming so close after that conjunction with Uranus, or saying no to something else, or maybe having to go on a diet from like the things that it was experiencing in the sensual realm earlier in the month, where Austin, you were talking about the ice cream boat or what have you.
Yeah. The ice cream boat sunk, Chris. The ice cream's not coming.
It was torpedoed. Okay.
This is when Venus puts away the video games and gets back to work.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to do that earlier than this.
Yeah.
No, but on a live level, one thing I noticed with just the condition of Venus is like just baseline, like how pleasurable things are. And often when Venus is, square Saturn, or just, in a really rough temporary condition, I'll find myself just like, man, I hate this, whatever it is. I'll just, you'll just get a this sucks. This isn't making me happy. Like, I don't like work. I don't like play, et cetera, et cetera. Like afflicted Venus can just be like an ambient bad mood where nothing satisfies.
I also think that Venus Saturn aspects are really they can be really constructive in relationships. I think that they're often like a moment of checking in and saying like, hey, let's level on this and let's get on the same page on this, or let's work toward this. So I think that they can ultimately be constructive, but they can also highlight things that are problematic. And yeah, I mean, they're both in their domicile, which makes it an interesting aspect, but Saturn is a little stronger. So Saturn's like, Venus, I know we want to be comfortable, but we have to take care of this very crucial thing in order to have that. So
yeah. So maybe sometimes like the setting of appropriate boundaries or the renegotiation of boundaries as a Venus-Saturn theme.
Yeah, just like with ongoing relationships, and a renegotiation of the structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Structure of expectations and mutual obligations and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Since we're a little bit more than halfway through the episode, I needed to take a break to mention our sponsor this month, which is the Ephemeris.co astrology birth chart pendant, where on this website you can actually go and get enter in your birth data and then select what zodiac and what house system you want, and you can actually get a copy of your birth chart printed up in this beautiful metal necklace that you can wear and take to parties or astrology conferences or what have you, just in case you want to show off your birth chart, in case you are not a Scorpio rising and you want to show everybody your birth chart and just like be able to share and point out your birth chart placements right there on a necklace. So the necklaces are gender neutral. They also, you can enter your birth data and customize it with different options, and they're always integrating new things like zodiacs or house systems, which is great in terms of picking your preferred one. All of the pieces are unique and handmade in the United States, and they have sold over 17,000 orders. So it's actually becoming more and more popular. So you can find out more information about this, and you can actually get a 10% discount if you use the promo code, all one word, astrology podcast on their website, ephemeris.co. So it's a pretty cool little thing. And I've got one made out of my birth chart, and I'm pretty happy with it. You can also get an inscription on the back.
Is
if
that
you want to
yours,
write,
Chris?
Yeah.
Do you look at that for self-affirmation in the morning?
It's for myself, that inscription there. It says, I love you to the moon and back, because I'm trying to lean into my 7th house Leo placements, which for me is all about self-love.
What, your first house moon? I thought so.
Yeah.
I thought I heard you whispering that to yourself when we were warming up for the show.
No, I mean, what's funny is the one that I've got one right here that I got made with my birth chart, and it says Amor Fati on the back. So love your fate, actually, is what mine says.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Actually, not that far, is actually very similar and kind of maybe an indirect way of saying love yourself, love your birth chart, love what you've been given, and come to some acceptance of it. So maybe you're right, Austin. You're making me reflect on that. I'm actually just talking about
self-love. This reminds me of one of my
self-love.
very favorite stories about you that I'm not going to tell on air.
Okay.
It's not too scandalous, but I'm going to pass. But it was a conversation you had with someone many years ago, and an article was written about it, and your final words were amor fati.
Okay, that was like an interview or something like that. I mean, I do, like, you always tell the story about like my Aquarius moon when I took a friend of ours who got sick at like an astrology conference to the like doctor because she had like a cold or something like that, and they were, just in bad shape, and I handed them like Valens or something like that, and I said, here, you should read this. I think this would really help you with your condition, like philosophically or something like that. And you always laughed at that. It's
pretty good.
Yeah,
That is.
You know what's good?
Well, those are really cute.
Little Dimetap and a little stoicism.
Little stoicism,
we'll
little
set you
stoic
up.
philosophy. That'll totally help you feel better. Moon in Aquarius.
No, but you have your moon in the first in Aquarius is very isn't just hilariously stoic. You're a great listener. Like literally half of your job is being a great listener.
You are.
Yeah, that moon in the first house, I'm actually much more caring and engaged, especially one-on-one, than one would think, due to the Aquarius-ness and otherwise Saturn prominence in my chart. But anyways, that's turning into a long, weird digression for our sponsor for this month.
That's totally my fault.
But have you guys gotten, copies of your birth chart, or would you wear a copy of your birth chart maybe to a conference or something like that? It's a little bit more than, you go to a conference usually, and sometimes at NORWAC they'll have like your sun, moon, and rising. I think this is like the next level up from that.
Yeah, you can, if you have one too many, you can just be like, look. Yeah, no, those are super cute. They look really quality and handcrafted. And I like the chain. I like even the round chain on them. And yeah, that sounds like a really cool and really thoughtful gift to give to someone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I don't think I need to be reminded of my birth chart any more than I am. So I definitely won't get one. But I would like everyone I talk to at NORWAC to have one. It'll help the conversation flow. I won't have to ask to see anybody's chart. I can just literally stare awkwardly at their collarbones.
Just glance at it. Always quick glance. Yeah, that's actually one thing I do not envy you going to NORWAC next week, is I'm terrible with names, but I do remember birth charts and birth placements.
Yeah,
so sometimes
that's the astrologer thing. You're like, what's her name? The ascendant's at like 24 Sag, and it's configured to like there's a Saturn Neptune, and you'll start pulling together an entire detailed portrait, but you can't remember like, Susie or whatever the name is.
Yeah, I'll usually be like, hey, Sun in Aries and Mercury in Scorpio, nice to meet you again. And they'll be like, my name is actually Bob.
Yeah.
You don't remember? Yeah.
Chartographic memory.
And it's ironic because you'll start like, because you're thinking of the chart and you're like, oh yeah. And then you had this kind of upbringing and there's this and that, like all this like, information, but you can't remember like,
right.
Oh, it's Jim. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, Jim.
I remember what happened to you at age of 16 and what Time Lords you were having at that exact moment.
Right. Yeah, you have a Venus retrograde, and that was the second time you had a Venus return. There was also a Venus retrograde, and that was a really crazy first love story. I remember, it's like the inverted memory where you can't remember the simple thing, but you've got like 30,000 words of intel that comes up.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thanks to our sponsor, ephemeris.co. And once again, the promo code is Astrology Podcast. All right, so let's get into the second half of the month and start talking about what we get into once we get a little bit further into June, when we get that ingress of the sun eventually into Cancer. Venus departs from Taurus and moves into Gemini, both of those around the 21st and 22nd of the month.
Well, and that's, although the sun, the sun's movement into Cancer is definitely like, as we say, it's like cooling off from the like fast overheat of Gemini, right? At the same time, we have Venus moving into Gemini and also getting configured to Jupiter, basically going into sextile with the Aries stuff and sharing the sign with super fast Mercury and Gemini. So it's really, it's a lot of movement. It's not going to feel like it's not like the sun's movement into a nurturing water sign, I think, is going to get very overshadowed by how active the planets are, right? If we look at just elemental placements of the 7 visible planets, right? Like we've got Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Venus in active fire and air signs.
Yeah, that's so true. So we really move away from the fixed signs, the slowness of Taurus, the slowness of really all of the fixed signs at this point, and instead we get this concentration on Gemini, which is already a quick sign, on the 2 cardinal signs of Aries and Cancer. So we start getting a lot of movement basically by this later portion of the month.
Yeah, it seems like a continuation of that energy that we were talking about with the Sagittarius full moon, right? To go back to the archer analogy, like launching the arrow, but it's like traveling. And it's, if anything, at full speed, a week later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes sense also because we're finally out of the Mercury retrograde shadow, because Mercury finally leaves 4 or 5 degrees of Gemini where it originally went retrograde. It gets back to that point by June 18th. So everything after that point is Mercury treading new ground and moving sort of at full speed or moving at fast speed at this point forward into uncharted territory as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before we get there too, one last thought about Venus before she leaves Taurus is that, when looking at the axis of Taurus and Scorpio being especially pronounced right now with eclipses, we're seeing like a major emphasis on resources. And so I think Venus aligning with that North Node and Uranus, it's going to do some interesting things to the markets, I think. And how I think that there's just like a lot of change right now where people are sourcing their materials and things like that, especially in Europe. And I know that crypto is going kind of crazy already. So it'll be interesting to see what happens around there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like we were saying, or I was saying earlier about the first part of Venus and Taurus being kind of stabilizing, but like that doesn't last long. And it's, it's like, oh, the ice cream ship is sunk, or no, well, the ice cream's here, but we don't, we don't have containers for the ice cream, so we can't sell it. It's the same kind of stuff that's been happening whenever the Uranus, whenever the fixed sign stuff gets activated this year. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, so Venus moving through Gemini and a quickening of the pace of things. Venus and Gemini with Mercury in Gemini, that's a lot more social, a lot more chatty, a lot more quick interactions between people and in terms of communication and writing and things like that.
Yeah, and there's something, I should say, that the Venus and Gemini, especially with Mercury there and with the configurations, can be refreshingly superficial. You know what I mean? It's like, no, we don't need to talk about the depths of, how we feel about the world and, what moves us, the most deeply. Sometimes it's nice to just like have some banter.
Yeah. Not every conversation needs to go to the greatest depths of one's like psyche and like your relationship with two people or something like that, which I don't understand personally as a Mercury and Scorpio, but I'll take your word for it that that's the case.
Well, let me know how you're feeling after the Venus square Saturn. And see if you're ready for maybe things to get a little lighter.
A little lighter, yeah.
Well, I think of Mercury and Venus and Gemini as making a lot of plans with people who you haven't seen in a while. Like you just feel inspired to text so-and-so and say, hey, let's make a plan. Let's make a date. I want to see you. And then like due to the flakiness too of Venus and Gemini, you end up canceling a lot of plans because now it's Cancer season. And you're like, oh, I just kind of want to go back to my routine a little bit. But I think the desire of Venus and Gemini wants to make a lot of plans. She wants to socialize. She wants to be a little butterfly.
Yeah. There's like that motion, right? Especially with Mercury and Gemini too, right? Like, let's go over here. Let's see what that's like. Let's play a game. I haven't seen blah, blah, blah in a while. Just like, bouncing around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's something refreshing about that.
Totally. Just sort of riffing off a similar theme from Venus and Uranus, just like craving something different in the routine.
Right.
So seeking variety in Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the seeking of variety and the enjoyment of having lots of things that don't go very deep, but that there's still an enjoyment and a fulfillment in spreading yourself a little bit more wide for a period of time rather than deep.
Yeah, and there's definitely a curiosity there too. So conversation flows easily when, you have two very curious planets that want to ask a lot of questions and get caught up. But yeah, like you said, not go too deep. Keep it light and keep it playful. And yeah, the energy is really just like whimsical and there's a lot of charm there. And it's even a little flirtatious, like just... I mean, where I live, it's like that's the time when you go out and you start to see people you haven't seen in a long time. So the energy is really fitting there.
That makes me think of, I was watching like a comedy podcast recently where they were competing for like who is better at making small talk And just that thing that you sometimes have to do when you have a very brief like interaction with somebody and you want to have like the most pleasant but efficiently short interaction possible and yet still leave a relatively positive impression. And like, how do you do that rather than, as you were saying, Austin, earlier, like every short interaction, you do not have to like plumb and go to the depths of each other's like soul if it's just going to be like a quick 30-minute conversation.
I love that with you and your Mercury Saturn, a quick conversation is 30 minutes.
Yeah, I actually meant to say 30 seconds, but you're right. Point still stands that even attempting to say that, I can't imagine only making a 30-second conversation. So my brain just like defaults to 30 minutes.
Yeah, the planets do incline. They may not compel, but they certainly incline.
So TikTok isn't your thing, Chris?
No, not yet. I mean, maybe I'll like set up a TikTok one of these days. I've been dragging my feet on it and like maybe do some like catchy dances or something like that. No, not my thing yet, but we'll see what happens once Venus goes into Gemini.
Yeah.
So that does remind me that this is a good time to mention because this is very close to our auspicious electional date for this month, which is the lucky date that Lisa Scheim and I picked out. And let me just pull up and animate the chart because I think it's on June 26th with Virgo rising. So with this, go ahead and cast a chart for June 26th and then adjust the time to about 10:55 in the morning, 10:55 a.m. or so. You'll end up with a chart that has Virgo rising, which is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is located at 15 degrees of Gemini in the 10th whole sign house in its own domicile. So there you'll also find Venus is also already in the sign of Gemini, and we also find the moon in Gemini, where it's separating from a conjunction with Venus, a sextile with Jupiter in Aries, and it's applying to a conjunction with Mercury with reception in the 10th house. So this is a very 10th house focused chart, a very communication focused chart with Mercury there in Gemini. So it would be good for things having to do with career, reputation, communication, and other sort of 10th house activities with a Virgo and Mercury or Gemini type flair to them. Let's see, what else does this chart have? It has some very helpful sextiles from Jupiter and Aries over to the planets in Gemini, especially Venus, where Venus is still applying to a sextile with Jupiter in the 8th house. Even though it does have Jupiter in the 8th, it's not super great for 8th house things having to do with borrowing money or debt or taxes or other things like that, because it has Mars in the 8th house in a day chart. But it's otherwise one of the best, I think, Mercury elections for the year that I can remember finding, just because it has Mercury in such a good placement in Gemini, Mercury ruling the ascendant, and Mercury is largely unafflicted in this chart, but is instead in pretty good shape. So yeah, what kind of things would you guys use a Mercury election for, like this, or just in general abstractly?
Probably writing things, maybe talking about things, which, it's a joke, but like, I mean, my career is writing and talking about things. So like finding good moments to write and talk about things, if that's your job, or if those are the activities, through which you do your job, it's actually really important.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful election, and anything to do with sharing media or sharing an article you published or announcing maybe a class or anything just media or content related, I think would be really great for that. Because, I mean, that's something a lot of people can relate to these days.
Yeah, maybe that's when I will start that TikTok account.
There you go.
We'll see what happens.
Well, and also sometimes there are important communications, right? Like you're like, oh, I'm going to write blah, blah, blah about blank, but I'm not sure what the right time is, right? Good Mercury with benefics is the time to do that, like asking a favor or proposing something that the other person could reject. Maybe you work in entertainment and it's like, oh, like, when am I going to pitch this project that I've been working on, right? You want like good communication with benefics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So this is one of, I think, 4 or 5 electional charts that we found this month. And the rest of those electional charts that we found are reserved for the Auspicious Elections podcast, which I put out each month with Lisa Scheim as one of the bonuses through the $20 tier on our page on patreon.com. So you can sign up for that through our page on Patreon at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. In order to get access to that. It was just published, I think, a day or two ago. And then we also recently discounted our 2022 electional astrology report, where we went through and picked electional charts and gave the single best election we could find for each of the next 12 months. Since we're halfway through the year at this point, we've discounted it half off for that electional report, which you can find at courses.theastrologyschool.com.
Very nice. Oh, I made in my notes an anti-election.
Oh, yeah.
I was just looking through I was like, on the 18th, we have Venus conjunct Algol and the North Node perfectly square Saturn while the moon is conjunct Saturn. I was like, I think that's the anti-election for the month.
Oh, man,
not a day to get married.
This one right here.
Maybe that's not the time to do the important things. Yeah, there we go. Just,
That's like some of those elections in the Picatrix where it's like, if you want to destroy a city, pick an electional chart like this and then create something and bury it under the sand or something like that.
Yeah, in the old Ouroboros press translation, which was from which is uneven, but from the Arabic, so it had from the medieval Arabic, so it has a different flavor than from the Latin. The way that bring malefics to the ascendant is translated is bring evil to the ascendant. And I was like, I know what that means.
Yeah, it's a funny part of electional astrology that we don't often think of, which is because most time, 99% of the time, astrologers are picking good charts to do good things, but then theoretically you could also pick the worst time. And that's kind of a good exercise if you're learning electional astrology, which is to see what happens when you pick just like the worst chart possible for something and just see how it goes. That can be learning by fire or trial by fire in some sense.
And sometimes you do
this
that
is my design.
In hindsight, like in 2020,
right.
You're like, why did that go so terribly? And then you look at the chart and you're like, oh.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. My experience of electional astrology and people learning electional astrology is you will rebel enough. You don't have to plan it. You will rebel enough, be like, whatever, I'm just going to do it. It's right. Fine. Totally. And then, then you get the feedback.
Yeah. My famous sandwich electional story last month is now burned into my brain.
Yes.
I got poisoned Moon Mars conjunction. Don't ever. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, everyone I think has that experience at some point of like burning your hand on the stove or, touching something that's really hot and then quickly pulling your hand back. And then you kind of remember from that experience, like it gets ingrained in your psyche on some level not to do that again. And sometimes that's, I feel like, kind of how electional astrology can work.
Yeah. Don't go to the dentist on a Pluto station. I did that. And I didn't have my ephemeris when I scheduled it. And I was like, oh, it's a Pluto station. Let's see what happens. This was years and years ago. And I ended up needing to get a root canal from it. Like, oh, the worst. I'll never forget that.
The tooth underworld.
Mm-mm.
All right. So we're getting towards the later portion of the month where I think one of the next things we need to talk about is our second lunation of the month, which is a new moon in the sign of Cancer on the 28th that happens the same day that Neptune stations retrograde in Pisces. So let me show the chart for that. That is not it. There we go. All right. So this new moon is taking place at 7 degrees of Pisces, or 7 degrees of Cancer, right there on June 28th, later in the day. We still have Venus in Gemini at this time, Mercury in Gemini. What else is going on? It looks like this lunation is very closely squaring Jupiter, which is at 7 degrees of Aries at this time. It's also the same day. It looks like Venus is exact sextiling Jupiter from 7 degrees of Gemini to 7 degrees of Aries at this time, almost exactly to the minute at this point, which is pretty striking.
Yeah, it's our second lunation that seems to directly involve Jupiter in Aries, which is kind of cool.
Mm.
And I know we were talking before we started recording about the eclipses and how the eclipse in the sign of Scorpio, the sign of the moon's fall, sort of brought on like a climax of baby formula shortage. And so I'm looking at this.
We didn't actually end up mentioning that. You should mention that because that's actually a really good point. Oh, did we talk about it? Okay.
So yeah, but here with the new moon in the sign of Cancer, where the moon is in its domicile and it's square a benefic Jupiter, and Jupiter often has a lot to do with babies and the creation of them. I'm hopeful that by the end of June with this new moon is when we'll see those shelves restocked. I'm really hopeful for that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a pretty comforting, well-supplied moon.
Yeah, there's an important nurturing component to the moon and to Cancer, and I think that goes all the way back. I think Valens mentions that already in the 2nd century, this notion of nurturing or nurturing of another being a core archetypal signification of the moon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of those more lovely looking lunations, I think. One of the, we haven't seen too many of those lately. And yeah, this new moon in Cancer, it's unafflicted. And there is a station from Neptune that's happening on this day too. So I'm really sort of tapping into the watery, sort of restful energy. I think one of the things the sign of Cancer really reminds us is that you can't draw from an empty well. And I think on Neptune stations, very often there's a call to retreat or seek magic or to just check out a little bit. And so I feel like, I guess this month is sort of bookended by that energy of just restfulness and taking care of yourself. And in this case, watering yourself where you feel, I think Cancer is really good at tuning into what it is that we need to feel safe and secure and that we're thriving.
Yeah, I get a similar feeling. I was thinking of the configuration of that Jupiter in Aries. And it's a benefic, so it's useful, but it's a square. And I was just thinking of the contrast in level of activity between a new moon in Cancer and Jupiter in Aries. And I wonder if that's going to be a little bit of okay, so you ran around, you did a lot of things, settle down for a second, refuel, get ready to accomplish more things by not trying to accomplish anything for a couple days. Take in the ground you've covered, take in, what you've done. But, sort of settle in with that, refuel and, take a day off.
Yeah, I like that. So thinking of what is restful, what is replenishing, and what is nurturing when it comes to yourself, and the need for that sometimes to recharge and replenish. All right, that's good. That is getting very late in the month at this point. It looks like there is a Mars-Pluto square that is forming by that point, but it goes exact a couple of days later from 27 degrees of Aries to 27 degrees of Capricorn just before we end the month. So that's not a super easy aspect to end the month with. What are some of your keywords for Mars, Pluto?
Well, I mean, the classic one is power struggle. Mm-hmm. Right? Mars as the sort of visible power and Pluto as the invisible sort of power. With Mars Pluto, there's feeling manipulated or silenced, those kind of feelings, whatever, and just power dynamics in general tend to become, should I say, more emotionally obvious and less tolerable, right? Sometimes to an exaggerated degree.
Yeah, sometimes to an explosive degree.
Yeah, well, and I think that's especially true here in the Pluto and Capricorn years, where, it's Pluto in a very Saturnian mode, right? Which can be, when you add Pluto and Saturn, it can be a very suppressive feeling energy. And Mars in Aries, would like to have as little of that as possible.
Yeah, it definitely feels a little bit like an eruption. Mars Pluto for me, it always brings up the energy of volatility. But it's a powerhouse energy, right? So, a lot of times the way we see it play out in the world is a little different than how we're feeling it. On a personal level, I think it's definitely like a powerhouse energy where there's that compulsive layer of Pluto where you're like, I just have to do it. I just have to take the risk, or I have to confront the issue or whatever it might be, or just face my fear so I think it can move obstacles too. I think it can also just sort of blow things up and clear the path as well.
Yeah. And, Mars in Aries just wants to move forward sort of single-mindedly, but it's getting this weird sort of behind the scenes sort of manipulative energy from that square with Pluto, where Mars is moving forward, but there's something else sort of behind the scenes calling the shots a little bit. So maybe paying attention to dynamics like that, or dynamics or areas where you're trying to move forward, perhaps move forward quickly in some area, but may not understand ways in which those actions are being controlled or manipulated in some way by forces that are larger or sort of outside of your control. All right. That kind of is bringing us to the end of the month here in terms of the forecast for June. Are there any major configurations that we didn't talk about? I mean, we do have the Neptune station at 25 Pisces, so that's about as late as Neptune has gotten at this point in its journey through Pisces. There is an intensification of some of that Neptune energy, but it's not super accentuated in terms of configurations with other planets quite yet at this point in late June, aside from just it inherently being an intensification through that station of Neptune at that degree. So I'm not sure if there's any reason to dwell on that anymore or say anything more about that in terms of the Neptune and Pisces transit.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting that both lunations this month have strong configurations with Jupiter and Neptune. So yeah, there's lots of just mushrooming energy, I think, or expanding a sense of possibility or hopefulness or dreamscape of some kind. But it's also interesting that there's just a lot happening around that 24, 25 right now. So that's kind of nice, actually, that while Scorpio is dealing with the South Node and the square from Saturn in the late degrees, that trine from Neptune has got to be pretty helpful there.
Right. Yeah. And Paula Bellomini in the chat points out that Mercury is square to Neptune, which I saw building, but it doesn't go exact until July 2nd. But that's definitely building up and will, I guess, because Neptune's stationing could become more relevant in activating that square with Mercury a little bit earlier. So the potential for a lack of clarity or illusions or even deception in communication in that very late part of June and early part of July, just due to that Mercury-Neptune square.
Yeah, some of the clear, quick, decisive movement from Mercury kind of blurring out and fading. Yeah, the only thing that I have, in my thinking about as we're getting into this period is really just remembering that when Mars is that late in Aries, that means it's just about in Taurus, and that's going to be, that'll be another. Mars is joining Uranus and Rahu, and reactivating that square with Saturn. That's a whole nother round of stuff that we talked about plenty in the yearly.
Yeah, that's a whole.
I believe that moves in on July the 4th.
Yeah, that is the whole Mars and Taurus stuff, and eventually the build up to Mars conjoining Uranus and the North Node almost simultaneously at some point this summer. I think that was in August or something.
1st or 2nd.
Yeah, which is one of the standout configurations for this year. But we're going to have to save that discussion until next month.
It's a cliffhanger.
Yeah, we always got to leave it on a cliffhanger. It's like a Netflix series where you end the episode on a cliffhanger so that people come back for next time. That is what we're doing here on the Astrology Podcast. Thank you both for joining me today.
That's what the universe does with time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like every month. Well, I mean, the universe doesn't do it. I mean, the universe is probably experiencing time as like this wave or even like instantaneously in some sense, because everything that will ever happen, every astrological alignment that will ever happen is already mapped out, and you can pick it up in an ephemeris and look at it in a book. It's just us and our limited perspectives as humans that experience time, moving forward at this rate and in these segments or sequences that we sometimes break up. But that might be more on us than it is on the universe in some sense.
Are we not the universe?
Are we? Are we the universe experiencing itself? Maybe.
I don't know. I heard that time was a giant golden serpent slowly unwinding. And then when it starts coiling again, time will be destroyed. And that made the most sense to me.
All right, I'll take that. I'll think about that, and we'll have to come back on that note next month for the forecast for July.
We're ending
Check in
with
on the time serpent.
existential Neptune stationing things.
Yeah, no, great call.
Yeah.
Great call.
I like that. All right. So, Catherine, where can people find out more about your work?
So you can find me on my website, catherineurban.com. I share my events and my blog posts. I try to keep up with blog posts, but I have a baby. So sometimes I take the week off and spend time with my 2-year-old, who is my whole world. But yeah, my website is where you can book consultations with me, get on my mailing list, stay up to date. I don't send out too many emails, I promise. And yeah, coming up, I have the Astrology Gathering. It's a little conference in Lilydale, and that is going to be September 15th through 18th. So I've got that going on. You can find that on my website. And yeah, I have a couple monthly meetups in the juggle that I do for astrologers who are wanting to develop and hone their knowledge a little bit. I've got an open level that I'm creating right now. And I also have an intermediate monthly meetup where we develop new techniques and deepen our knowledge in that way. So that's what I got going on right now. And yeah, that's where you can find me. Last thing, I'm at Astro Catherine on all platforms. So on Instagram, Twitter.
Instagram. Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. And I would strongly recommend people check out your YouTube channel as well, which is youtube.com/CatherineUrban, just because you do a very good job of breaking down some of these individual alignments and planetary points that we're talking about into short, much more digestible videos than the 2-hour long, deep, intensive dives that I do. And I think people should check out your channel and subscribe to it because they'd probably really enjoy it if they enjoyed some of the stuff that we talked about here in this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, Austin, what do you have going on aside from diving into the fire of going straight to an astrology conference with 500 people immediately after this?
So, there's that. Hello to everybody I'm going to see in 24 hours. And then as far as this month, teaching classes, Kate's planning on releasing, I think, towards the end of the month, might be beginning of July, might be end of June, Sphere Sundry's first ever lunar series. We waited until no more malefics or nodes in Cancer and Capricorn, and nice benefics in Pisces to trine and support a Cancer moon. So there's going to be some glorious Cancer moon materia coming out before too awful long. Again, start paying attention second half of June. And in the meantime, there was a bunch of awesome stuff that's not sold out yet. There's the Full Hot stuff that was released last month, which is awesome. And I think there's still some good Venus in Libra, really choice Venus in Libra from last year, and some of that Regulus as well. Anyway,
Nice.
So anyway, moon stuff's coming out. It's going to be awesome.
So exciting.
SphereandSundry.com.
Yep,
So,
SphereandSundry.com.
SphereandSundry.com, and then your website is AustinCoppock.com, right?
Yep, but don't go there because I'm not doing anything this month. I'm teaching classes that are all closed to the public
All
now.
right. Do not go to
Bother
Austin's
me at
website,
NORWAC.
whatever you do.
Bother Kate at SphereandSundry.com.
Okay. Good advice. And as for myself, I'm just going to keep doing the astrology podcast. I'm starting to do local astrology meetings here in Denver at the Mercury Cafe. You can find out more about that by going to meetup.com and searching for the Denver Astrology Group. Patrick Watson's coming out in a couple of weeks, and we're going to do a workshop on rectification as well as record a new course on rectification over the course of a week. I'm also going to keep doing the podcast, and if people enjoy this work or want to support that, the best way to do so is just sign up through my page on patreon.com, and in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content like early access to new episodes or episodes that are exclusive only to Patreon members. So, all right, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology podcast. So thank you both for joining me for this forecast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Chris. This was really fun.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime. All right, that's it for this episode. So thanks to everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the podcast, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Coppock, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly Auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at hellenisticastrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.